You're going to apologize to her right now." The words hadn't been spoken yet, but they hung in the air like a question no one dared to ask as the crystal glass slipped from Vanessa Hale's fingers and shattered across the polished marble floor, the sharp crack slicing through the low hum of conversation, while deep red wine spread across Maya Brooks' hand, staining her skin and dripping silently onto the white linen beneath her tray, and for a brief second, the entire restaurant seemed to pause, as if even the chandeliers above were holding their breath, forks frozen halfway to lips, eyes slowly turning, calculating, watching, waiting, and Vanessa didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't even glance at the broken glass at her feet. Instead, she let out a soft, almost amused exhale as she looked at Maya, her gaze cool and distant, the kind of look that measured worth in silence. "Honestly," she said, brushing an invisible speck from her sleeve, "I don't understand how someone like you gets hired in a place like this." Her voice carried just enough to ripple through nearby tables, drawing quiet attention, uncomfortable shifts, lowered gazes, and Maya stood there, her posture straight, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the edge of the tray, but her face remained composed, her expression neutral, not submissive, not defiant, just steady, as if she had learned long ago that dignity didn't need to be loud to be powerful. And across from Vanessa, Ethan Caldwell sat still, one hand resting lightly against the table, his jaw set but unreadable, his silence stretching longer than it should have, long enough for a few guests to exchange glances, long enough for the tension to thicken into something tangible, and Vanessa noticed it too, her lips curling faintly as she leaned back in her chair, confident, comfortable, as though the moment belonged to her. "I mean, really," she continued, her tone dipping into something sharper, something colder. "It's embarrassing," and that word lingered, heavy, deliberate, hanging in the air like a challenge, like a line drawn in front of everyone watching, and still, Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even look at Maya. And for a split second, it felt like the room had already decided how this would end. Another moment brushed aside, another quiet humiliation absorbed and forgotten, but then Maya moved, just slightly, setting the tray down with careful precision before reaching for a cloth, her voice calm, measured, untouched by the sting of the words thrown at her. "I'll clean this up for you, ma'am," she said softly, not as submission, but as control, as choice, as something entirely her own, and that, more than anything, seemed to irritate Vanessa, who let out a short laugh under her breath, shaking her head as if amused by something no one else could see. "Of course you will," she replied, her tone laced with something that didn't need to be named to be understood, and that was when Ethan's fingers finally curled against the table, just slightly, just enough for the smallest shift to ripple through his posture. A movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way the air changed around him, tightening, sharpening, as if something invisible had snapped into place, his gaze lifting at last, not hurried, not reactive, but deliberate, his eyes settling first on the wine spreading across the table, then on Maya's steady hands, and finally on Vanessa, and there was something in that look now, something different, something that made the faint confidence in Vanessa's expression flicker for the briefest moment, as though she suddenly realized the room was no longer hers, as though she could feel the weight of every eye shifting, recalibrating, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the silence, before pushing his chair back with a quiet scrape that seemed to echo louder than the glass had when it shattered, and as he stood, the entire restaurant leaned into the moment without realizing it, drawn into the gravity of what would come next, because this was no longer about a broken glass, no longer about a spill or a mistake, it was about something else entirely, something unspoken but undeniable, and when Ethan finally spoke, his voice wasn't raised, wasn't sharp, but it carried, clear and steady, cutting through the tension with quiet precision. "You're right," he said, and for a heartbeat, Vanessa smiled, thinking she understood, thinking she had already won, until he took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers, and added, "It is embarrassing." Vanessa's smile lingered for just a fraction too long before it faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly as she searched Ethan's face for reassurance that never came, the faint confidence she carried moments ago now shifting into something less certain, more fragile, and around them, the restaurant remained suspended in silence, every guest now fully invested, every glance sharpened with curiosity as if witnessing something far more significant than a simple exchange, and Ethan did not rush his next words. He let the pause stretch, let the weight of his presence settle into the space, his gaze steady, unwavering, not raised in anger but grounded in something far more controlled, something deliberate. "It is embarrassing," he repeated, slower this time, as though clarifying a truth that had just revealed itself, and Vanessa let out a small breath, a short laugh almost, attempting to reclaim the moment. "Exactly," she said quickly, leaning forward, her voice light but edged. "That is what I've been saying." But Ethan did not look at her as someone who agreed. He looked at her as someone who had already decided, and that subtle difference shifted everything, his attention briefly flickering toward the wine still spreading across the table, toward the cloth in Maya's hand as she continued her work with quiet precision, and then back to Vanessa. "It is embarrassing," he continued, his tone still calm, still even, "to sit across from someone who believes respect is optional." The words landed softly, but they did not need volume to carry impact. They moved through the room like a quiet wave, drawing a sharp inhale from a nearby table, a subtle shift from the manager standing in the distance, and Vanessa's posture stiffened, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of her chair. "Excuse me," she said, her voice lower now, less composed, more reactive, but Ethan did not raise his voice to meet hers. He remained steady, grounded, the kind of calm that does not escalate but instead reveals. "You heard me," he said simply, and there was no hesitation in it, no room for reinterpretation, just clarity, and for the first time since the glass had shattered, Vanessa looked unsure, not dramatically, not obviously, but in the smallest ways that only those watching closely would notice, the slight tension in her jaw, the brief flicker in her eyes, as if she was recalculating the situation, trying to find a version of it where she still held control. "You are overreacting," she replied, attempting to regain footing, her tone sharpening just enough to reassert dominance. It was an accident, and she should have been more careful, and as she said it, she gestured lightly toward Maya without looking at her, as if the presence of the woman she had just insulted did not require acknowledgement, and that gesture, that dismissal, seemed to settle something final in Ethan, because his expression did not change, but something behind it did, something that no longer questioned what needed to be done, and he turned slightly, just enough for his voice to carry more clearly across the surrounding tables, not louder, but intentional. "No," he said, the words simple, unmistakable. "This is not about the glass," and that line shifted the room again, pulled the focus away from the spill, away from the accident, and placed it exactly where it belonged. And Maya paused for the briefest second, not looking up, not inserting herself, but listening, aware, present, and Ethan continued, "This is about how you choose to treat people when you think it does not matter." And that sentence did something Vanessa had not expected. It removed the safety of the moment, the ability to dismiss it as trivial, and replaced it with something far more uncomfortable, something public, something undeniable, and a quiet murmur rippled at the edge of the room before quickly fading, because no one wanted to miss what came next, and Vanessa straightened, her chin lifting slightly as she tried to meet him at his level, to reframe the conversation. "I think you are making a scene," she said, her tone now defensive, controlled but strained, "and I do not appreciate being spoken to like this in public." And for a moment, that might have worked, might have redirected the narrative, if not for the way Ethan responded, because he did not argue, he did not match her defensiveness, he simply looked at her, held that gaze, and said, "That is interesting." A faint pause, just enough to let the words settle, "Because you had no problem doing exactly that a minute ago." And that was when the balance shifted completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, as if the entire room collectively understood that whatever came next would not be undone, that a line had been crossed and acknowledged, and Ethan took a small step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward clarity, his voice lowering slightly, yet somehow reaching everyone. "You do not get to decide when respect matters," he said, and in that moment, Vanessa realized something she had not considered when the glass first fell. That this was no longer a private exchange, no longer a minor incident that would fade into the background of a dinner. This was a decision, unfolding in real time, and she was no longer in control of how it would end. Vanessa's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out at first, and that silence, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything she had said before, because for the first time since the evening began, she was no longer leading the conversation, she was reacting to it, and the shift was visible in the smallest details, the way her shoulders tightened, the way her fingers curled slightly against the polished edge of the table, as if trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. "You are blowing this out of proportion," she finally said, her voice steadier now but edged with strain, each word carefully placed, as though she could still reshape the narrative if she spoke precisely enough, and Ethan did not interrupt her. He allowed her the space, allowed her to say what she needed to say, but there was no longer any uncertainty in his expression, no hesitation left in his posture, only a quiet certainty that seemed to ground him in place. And Vanessa continued, her tone sharpening just enough to reclaim control. "It was a simple mistake, and instead of handling it professionally, she is standing here making it awkward for everyone." And as she spoke, she gestured again, this time more openly toward Maya, her hand cutting lightly through the air as if emphasizing a point that should have been obvious, and that gesture, that casual dismissal, hung in the air for a moment longer than expected, because this time, it did not land the same way, not after what had already been said, not after the room had shifted its attention, and Maya, who had resumed wiping the table with slow, deliberate movements, paused again. Just for a second, her hand still, the cloth resting lightly against the linen, her gaze lowering not in defeat but in focus, as if choosing carefully how to remain present without becoming part of the conflict, and Ethan noticed it, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but in the subtle tightening of his jaw, in the way his eyes softened for the briefest moment before returning to Vanessa, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not just clarity, but finality. "She is not the one making this awkward," he said, and the simplicity of that sentence cut through the room more cleanly than any raised voice could have, and Vanessa let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it, only disbelief. "So now you are defending her?" she asked, her eyebrows lifting slightly as if the idea itself was unreasonable, as if it required explanation, and Ethan did not rush his answer. He let the question settle, let the room feel its weight, before responding in the same calm tone that had not wavered once. "I am not defending her," he said, and for a split second, Vanessa's expression shifted, a flicker of relief, a belief that she had misunderstood, that perhaps the situation could still return to something familiar, something controllable. But Ethan continued before that thought could fully form. "I am recognizing her." And that word, simple as it was, seemed to land differently, not just on Vanessa, but on everyone listening, because it reframed everything that had just happened. It removed the idea of sides, of defense, and replaced it with something deeper, something more uncomfortable to ignore, and Vanessa's expression hardened again, her posture straightening as she leaned forward slightly. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice lower now, controlled but no longer as confident. "You are turning a minor incident into some kind of statement," and Ethan held her gaze unshaken. "It already was a statement," he replied quietly. "You just did not realize it." And that was when the silence returned. Heavier than before, thicker, more deliberate, as if the entire room had been drawn into a moment that could not be undone, and in that silence, the soft sound of fabric against glass echoed faintly as Maya resumed her work, finishing the last of the spilled wine, her movement steady, unhurried, as if the world around her had not just shifted, as if she had done this before, not the exact moment, but the feeling of it, the weight of being seen and unseen at the same time. And when she finally set the cloth aside, she reached for a fresh glass with the same quiet professionalism, her voice calm as she spoke. "I will bring you another one." And there was no tension in her tone, no trace of what had just happened, only composure, only control, and that, more than anything, seemed to settle something final in Ethan, because he turned slightly, not away from Vanessa, but toward Maya, his voice softening just enough to acknowledge her presence without drawing her further into the center of the conflict. "Thank you," he said, and it was a simple phrase, one that could have been said at any table, in any moment, but here, now, it carried something else, something intentional, something that did not go unnoticed, and Maya gave a small nod, nothing more, before stepping back, allowing space once again, and when Ethan turned back to Vanessa, there was no hesitation left, no uncertainty, only a quiet resolve that had fully taken shape. "This is not going to continue," he said, his voice steady, leaving no room for interpretation, and Vanessa stared at him, searching, as if trying to find the version of him she had expected, the version that would smooth things over, dismiss the moment, return to normal. But that version was no longer there, and the realization of that, slow and undeniable, began to settle in as the balance of the evening shifted completely out of her hands. Vanessa stared at Ethan as if the words had not fully reached her yet, as if her mind was still trying to reshape them into something less permanent, something easier to dismiss, but the way he stood there, composed, unshaken, made that impossible, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was decisive. It carried the quiet understanding that whatever came next would define more than just the evening. "You cannot be serious," she said at last, her voice lower now, controlled, but threaded with disbelief, her fingers lifting slightly from the table as if punctuating the statement, as if the weight of the moment could be pushed back with the right tone, and Ethan did not react to the challenge in her voice. He did not mirror it. He simply held his ground, his expression steady, his posture unchanged, and that stillness seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could have. "We are in the middle of dinner," she continued, glancing briefly around the room as if to gather support from the watching eyes, "and you are choosing to turn this into something dramatic." And for a moment, a few guests shifted in their seats, uncertain, not because they agreed, but because they recognized the attempt to redirect the narrative, to shrink the moment back into something manageable. But Ethan did not follow her there. He did not allow the scale to be reduced. "No," he said quietly, the word firm without needing force. "I am choosing not to ignore it." And that distinction, simple as it was, cut through the space between them with clarity, and Vanessa exhaled sharply, shaking her head as she leaned back in her chair, her composure beginning to show small fractures, not loud, not dramatic, but present. "This is unbelievable," she murmured, more to herself than to him, though the words carried, all of this over a spilled glass, and Ethan's gaze did not waver. "It was never about the glass," he repeated, and this time there was no room left for reinterpretation, no softness to cushion the truth, only the quiet weight of it settling fully into place, and across the table, the untouched plates, the dim candlelight, the carefully arranged setting all seemed to fade into the background, because the focus had narrowed to something far more essential, and Vanessa felt it, that narrowing, that shift away from surface details and into something deeper, something she could not easily control, and her tone changed again, softer now, but sharper in a different way. "So what exactly are you doing?" she asked, her eyes searching his, not for understanding, but for boundaries, for the point where this would stop, where it would return to something familiar, and Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer before answering. "I am deciding what I am willing to be part of," he said, and those words did not rise, did not fall. They simply existed, clear and grounded, and for the first time, Vanessa did not have an immediate response, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, then closing again as she processed the implication, because this was no longer about a disagreement, no longer about who was right or wrong in a passing moment. This was about alignment, about values, about something that extended beyond the table they were sitting at, and she straightened slowly, her posture regaining some of its former precision, her voice quieter now but carrying a sharper edge. "You are overcomplicating this," she said. "It is not that deep." And Ethan did not argue with the words themselves. He did not attempt to convince her otherwise. Instead, he simply said, "It is for me, And that response, so direct, so personal, left no room for negotiation, no space for her to reshape his perspective, and the distance between them, though only a few feet across the table, suddenly felt much larger, defined not by space but by understanding, or the lack of it. And Vanessa felt that distance settle in, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in that moment. "So what?" she said slowly, each word measured. "You are going to make a statement and walk away?" And Ethan paused, not because he was unsure, but because he was choosing his next words carefully, the way someone does when they know those words will not be taken back. And then he answered, "I am going to be consistent." And the simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than anything he had said so far, because it implied a pattern, a history, a standard that did not bend depending on the room. And Vanessa let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head as she looked down at the table for a moment before lifting her gaze back to him. "You are really doing this," she said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Ethan did not hesitate. "Yes," he replied, and in that moment, the final layer of uncertainty dissolved, leaving only the truth of the situation exposed, and around them, the room remained silent, attentive, aware that something irreversible was unfolding, something that would not be quietly forgotten once the night ended. And near the edge of the table, Maya returned with a fresh glass, placing it carefully down. With the same steady hands, her presence calm, unobtrusive, yet undeniably central to everything that had just shifted, and as she stepped back once more, Ethan's gaze followed her for just a second, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that acknowledged, before returning to Vanessa, where the decision now stood fully formed, waiting to be spoken aloud in a way that would change everything. Vanessa's laughter faded almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything spoken, her eyes searching Ethan's face one more time as if expecting a shift, a hesitation, some sign that this moment would soften and return to something familiar. But nothing changed. His posture remained steady, his gaze clear, and that was when the realization settled in fully, not sudden, but slow and undeniable, like a door closing quietly behind her. "You are actually choosing this," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of the confidence it once carried, and Ethan did not rush to respond. He allowed the words to sit between them, allow her to hear them as they were, before answering in the same calm tone that had not wavered since he stood up. "I am choosing what this represents," he said, and the distinction was subtle, but it landed with precision, because it shifted the focus away from the people at the table and toward something larger, something that could not be dismissed as personal disagreement. And Vanessa shook her head slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the stem of the untouched glass in front of her, as if grounding herself in something physical, something still within her control. "You are making a mistake," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You are letting one moment define everything," and Ethan's expression softened just slightly, not in doubt, but in understanding, as though he recognized the thought behind her words, even if he did not agree with them. "No," he replied, "I am recognizing that moments like this reveal everything," and the room seemed to absorb that sentence, the quiet truth of it settling over the space like a weight that could not be ignored, and Vanessa's eyes flickered briefly, not with anger, but with something closer to frustration, the kind that comes when logic no longer shifts the outcome, when the usual paths of persuasion no longer apply. "So what now?" she asked, the question no longer sharp, no longer strategic, but genuine in a way that had not been present before. And Ethan looked at her for a moment, not as an opponent, not as someone to defeat, but as someone he had once chosen, someone he had once believed aligned with him. And that made what came next quieter, but no less final. "Now I stop pretending this is something it is not," he said, and those words did not echo loudly, but they carried a permanence that resonated through the room, and Vanessa's posture stilled completely, as if even the smallest movement might disrupt what she was beginning to understand. "You are ending this," she said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, but something in between. And Ethan did not hesitate. "Yes," he answered, and there was no anger in it, no resentment, only clarity, And that clarity made it impossible to argue, impossible to twist into something else. And for a moment, Vanessa said nothing, her gaze dropping briefly to the table, to the faint stain. Where the wine had been, now gone, cleaned, leaving no visible trace of what had started it all, and yet everything had changed, and when she looked back up, her expression had shifted again, not entirely composed, not entirely undone, but caught somewhere in between. "Over this," she said softly, almost to herself, and Ethan shook his head just slightly. "Because of this," he corrected, and the difference between those two phrases settled into the silence, like a final line drawn and around them. The room remained still, attentive, aware that what they were witnessing was not just the end of a conversation, but the end of something far more significant, something that could not be undone with apologies or explanations. And near the edge of the table, Maya stood at a respectful distance, her hands folded lightly in front of her, not intruding, not withdrawing, simply present, her expression calm, unchanged, as if she understood that this moment did not belong to her, yet had been shaped by her presence all the same. And Ethan turned slightly toward her again, just enough to acknowledge her without shifting the focus entirely. "Thank you for your patience," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal, and Maya gave a small nod, her response simple, "Of course, sir." But there was something in the exchange, something unspoken, that carried more weight than the words themselves, and when Ethan turned back to the table, there was nothing left unresolved in his posture. No hesitation lingering in his stance, only a quiet certainty that the decision had been made fully, completely, and that it would not be undone, and Vanessa saw it, understood it, even if she did not accept it, and the space between them, once defined by shared plans and quiet agreements, now felt like something else entirely, something final, something that could not be crossed again. And as the soft hum of the restaurant slowly began to return, cautious, uncertain, the moment remained suspended. Just long enough for everyone present to realize that what they had just witnessed would not be forgotten, because it had not been loud, it had not been chaotic, but it had been undeniable, a quiet line, drawn in full view, and once drawn, it could not be erased. For a moment, no one moved, not Vanessa, not Ethan, not even the guests who had slowly begun to breathe again, because something about the stillness felt unfinished, as if the room itself was waiting for one final confirmation that this was real, that what had just been said would not be softened or taken back. And Vanessa's eyes lingered on Ethan, searching for even the smallest sign of reconsideration, but there was none, only that same quiet certainty that had settled into him and refused to shift. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was different, lower, steadier, but no longer carrying the same authority it once had. "So that is it," she said, her words measured, controlled, as if she were carefully placing them one by one. "You walk away and everything just ends." And Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood the weight behind the question, understood that it was not really about the moment at the table, but about everything that had led to it, and he let the silence hold for just a second longer before replying. "It does not just end," he said quietly. "It changes," and that distinction settled between them with a quiet finality, because it acknowledged what had been without pretending it could continue unchanged. And Vanessa's gaze dropped briefly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table again, a small, almost unconscious movement, as if she were grounding herself in something steady. While everything else shifted, "You are choosing this version of me," she said after a moment, her tone softer now, not defensive, not sharp, but searching, as if trying to understand how one moment had become so defining. And Ethan's expression softened again, just slightly, enough to show that he heard the question beneath her words. "No," he replied, "you showed it to me." And that answer, simple and unadorned, carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it removed interpretation, removed debate, and left only observation. And Vanessa inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just a fraction before settling again. The controlled composure she had relied on beginning to feel thinner now, less certain, and around them, the soft murmur of the restaurant had started to return, cautious, almost hesitant, as if the room itself was unsure whether it was allowed to move on yet, and a server passed quietly in the distance, the faint clink of silverware returning in small, careful increments, but the table they sat at remained untouched by that normalcy, still suspended in the moment that had just unfolded, and Ethan reached for his jacket, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm, deliberate motion that made it clear this was not an impulsive decision, but one that had fully settled into place, and as he slipped it over his shoulders, the subtle movement seemed to mark a transition, not just physically, but emotionally, a quiet signal that he was stepping out of what had been and into something else, and Vanessa watched him, her eyes following every movement, as if committing it to memory, as if trying to understand how it had all shifted so completely in such a short span of time. "You really believe this is about values," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now, and Ethan paused, his hand resting lightly against the back of the chair for just a moment before answering. "I know it is," and there was no hesitation in that response, no doubt left to question, and Vanessa let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting past him for a second, taking in the room, the people who had witnessed everything, the space that now felt different, altered by what had taken place, and when she looked back at him, there was something quieter in her expression, something that had replaced the earlier confidence, not fully acceptance, but something closer to awareness. "And what about everything else?" she asked softly. "Everything we planned," and Ethan's expression did not harden, did not dismiss the question. Instead, it held a quiet understanding, the kind that recognizes what is being left behind without trying to diminish it. "Plans only matter if the foundation is right," he said, and that sentence settled between them like a final truth, one that did not need elaboration. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching once more, but this time it was different. Not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, and near the edge of the table, Maya stood quietly, her presence steady as ever, her hands resting lightly together, not intruding, not withdrawing, simply existing within the moment without trying to shape it, and Ethan turned toward her again, just briefly, his voice softer now, more personal. "I am sorry you had to experience that," he said, and there was no performance in it, no attempt to draw attention, just a simple acknowledgement, and Maya met his gaze for a second, her expression calm, grounded. "I am used to standing in rooms where people decide who I am before I speak," she replied gently, and her words, though quiet, carried a depth that lingered in the air, not as accusation, but as truth, and Ethan nodded once, a small gesture, but one that showed he understood, or at least that he was listening. And when he turned back to Vanessa, there was nothing left unsaid, nothing left unresolved, only the quiet reality of what had been decided, and as he stepped away from the table, the soft sound of his shoes against the marble floor seemed to echo just slightly longer than usual, marking the end of something that had once felt certain, and the beginning of something else entirely. The soft echo of Ethan's footsteps had barely faded into the background hum of the restaurant when something unexpected happened, something subtle but powerful, because the room did not simply return to normal. It shifted, conversations resumed in hushed tones, slower, more careful, as if everyone was still processing what they had just witnessed, and at the center of it all, Vanessa remained seated, her posture still composed but no longer anchored in the same confidence, her eyes fixed on the empty space where Ethan had stood just moments ago, as though she could will the moment to rewind, to unfold differently, but it did not, and across the table, the untouched plates, the dim candlelight, and the faint reflection of the chandelier above now felt like remnants of something that had already passed, something that no longer held meaning in the same way, and for the first time that evening, Vanessa seemed smaller, not in presence, but in certainty, as if the structure she had relied on had quietly shifted beneath her without warning, and she inhaled slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the glass in front of her, the one Maya had just replaced, her reflection faintly visible in its surface, distorted slightly by the curvature, and for a brief moment, she looked at it, really looked, as though seeing something she had not noticed before. And then she looked up, her gaze moving instinctively toward Maya, who was already stepping away from the table, returning to her work with the same calm precision that had defined her from the beginning, and that contrast, that quiet steadiness in the face of everything that had just happened, seemed to linger in the air, unspoken but undeniable, and Vanessa hesitated, just for a second, as if considering something unfamiliar, something she was not used to examining, before her. Expression tightened slightly, retreating back into something more controlled, more familiar, and she straightened in her chair, reaching for her purse with a measured movement, as though reclaiming a sense of order, of direction, even if it felt thinner now, less certain, and at the edge of the dining room, Ethan paused near the exit, not turning back, not hesitating, but standing still for just a moment, as if allowing the weight of what had just happened to settle fully before stepping forward into whatever came next, and the doorman opened the glass door quietly, the cool air from outside brushing lightly against the warmth of the room, a subtle contrast that marked the transition between spaces, between moments, and as Ethan stepped out, the door closed behind him with a soft click that felt louder than it should have, like the final note of a scene that had not been planned but could not be undone, and inside, the restaurant continued to breathe again, slowly returning to its rhythm, but not quite the same, because something had shifted, something that lingered beneath the surface of every resumed conversation, every cautious glance, and near the center of the room, Maya moved. Between tables, her posture unchanged, her focus steady, as if the moment had not altered her, but there was something different in the way a few guests now looked at her, not with curiosity or dismissal, but with something quieter, something closer to respect, and she did not acknowledge it, did not seek it. She simply continued, placing a glass here, adjusting a plate there, her movements precise, intentional, grounded, and as she passed by the table once more, where Vanessa now stood, gathering her things with a composed efficiency that bordered on urgency, their eyes met briefly, just for a second. And in that moment, there was no hostility, no confrontation, only a quiet recognition of what had occurred, and Vanessa looked away first, her gaze dropping as she turned toward the exit, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she walked, each step measured, controlled, but carrying a different weight now, something less certain, something that had been unsettled, in a way she could not immediately restore, and as she reached the door, she paused briefly, her hand resting against the cool metal handle, as if considering something she could not quite define, before pushing it open and stepping out into the night, leaving behind the warmth of the room and the moment that had changed it, and inside, Maya exhaled quietly, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to release the tension that had lingered beneath the surface, and she reached for another tray, lifting it with the same steady hands, ready to continue, because for her, the night was not over, the work was not done, and yet something had shifted, something that could not be measured in tips or tables, something quieter, deeper, that would remain long after the last guest had left, and somewhere beyond the glass doors, Ethan stood beneath the city lights, the reflection of the restaurant glowing faintly behind him, unaware that the moment he had just walked away from was not finished yet, that its impact was only beginning to unfold in ways none of them had expected. Outside, the city felt colder than it had a few minutes ago, not in temperature but in clarity, as Ethan stood on the sidewalk. Beneath the soft glow of streetlights, the hum of distant traffic filling the space that had just been occupied by quiet confrontation, and for the first time since he stepped away from the table, he allowed himself to exhale fully, the breath slow, controlled, as if releasing something that had been building long before the glass ever shattered, and behind him, through the tall windows of the restaurant, the golden light still flickered, silhouettes moving, life continuing, but it already felt distant, like something he had stepped out of rather than simply away from, and he adjusted his jacket slightly, his fingers brushing against the cuff as his gaze lifted toward the reflection in the glass, catching a faint image of himself layered over the room behind him, two versions existing at once, the one who had stayed silent in moments before, and the one who had just chosen differently, and for a brief second, he studied that reflection, not with doubt, but with a quiet recognition that something had shifted in a way that would not reverse, and a car passed by slowly, headlights sweeping across the pavement, breaking the stillness just enough to remind him where he stood, and yet he did not move, not immediately, because the moment did not feel finished, not completely, and inside. Maya moved through the dining room with the same steady rhythm, but something about the space felt altered, not in structure, not in appearance, but in perception, the way a few guests now watched her with a kind of awareness that had not been there before, not intrusive, not exaggerated, but present, and she noticed it. Of course she did, not because it was obvious, but because she had learned to read rooms long before she had learned to trust them, and still, she did not let it change her pace, her posture, or her focus, because for her, the work remained the same, the responsibility unchanged, and yet, beneath that surface, something quieter had shifted, something that did not demand attention but existed nonetheless, and near the back of the room, the manager stood with a posture that had subtly adjusted, more attentive now, more aware of the weight of the environment he was responsible for, his eyes following Maya for a moment longer than before, not with scrutiny, but with something closer to reconsideration, as if the events of the evening had forced a perspective he had not fully examined until now. And at the entrance, the glass door opened briefly as a couple stepped in, their laughter light, unaware of what had just unfolded minutes earlier. And the contrast between their ease and the lingering tension in the room created a quiet dissonance that slowly began to settle, to blend, to reshape into something new. And outside, Ethan finally took a step forward, then another, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, each movement carrying the quiet weight of decision rather than reaction. And as he reached the edge of the curb, his phone vibrated softly in his pocket, a familiar interruption, a reminder of the world that continued regardless of personal moments, and he paused, pulling it out, the screen lighting up with a name he recognized instantly. A business partner, someone who would expect answers, clarity, direction, and for a moment, he looked at it without responding, his thumb hovering just above the screen as if considering whether to engage or to let the call pass, and then, slowly, he lowered the phone, letting it ring out, because for once, the urgency of that world did not take priority, and he slipped it back into his pocket, lifting his gaze again toward the restaurant, not to return, but to acknowledge, just once more, what had taken place within those walls. And inside, Maya reached the service station, placing her tray down gently before resting her hands against the counter for a brief second, not in exhaustion, not in relief, but in stillness, as if allowing herself a moment to process something she would not name out loud. And a co-worker approached quietly, offering a small, hesitant smile, not asking questions, not intruding, just present in a way that felt different from before, and Maya returned the smile. Small, composed, before picking up the next order ticket, her voice steady as she called it out, returning seamlessly to the rhythm of the evening. And yet, as she moved back into the dining room, there was a subtle shift in the way she held herself, not larger, not louder, but grounded in a way that felt deeper, as if something had been affirmed rather than changed. And outside, Ethan began to walk, the city unfolding around him in quiet motion, unaware that the choice he had just made would not remain confined to a single evening, that it would ripple outward in ways he had not yet seen. Because some decisions did not end when the moment passed, they continued, shaping what came next. And somewhere between the glow of the streetlights and the reflection in the glass behind him, that truth had already begun to take hold. The night did not end when Ethan walked away. It stretched, quietly unfolding into something neither he nor anyone inside the restaurant could yet fully see. And as he moved down the sidewalk, the rhythm of the city slowly absorbing him into its motion, there was a subtle shift in the way people noticed him, not because they knew what had just happened, but because something in his presence had changed, something quieter, more grounded, less concerned with being seen, and more certain about what it stood for. And a few blocks away, he paused near the edge of a crosswalk, the soft glow of the signal casting a pale reflection across the pavement, his gaze drifting for a moment as the events replayed, not in fragments, but in clarity, each word, each pause, each decision aligning into something that no longer felt reactive, but intentional. And for the first time in a long while, there was no second guessing in that reflection, no internal negotiation, just a steady understanding that the choice had been necessary, even if it had been difficult. and back inside the restaurant. The night carried on, but not unchanged. The conversations that resumed did so with a different tone, softer, more aware, as if the space itself had shifted its expectations without announcing it, and Maya moved through the room with the same quiet precision. But now there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when a guest would meet her eyes a second longer, or offer a nod that felt less automatic and more intentional, and she noticed those moments not as validation, but as something she had learned to recognize without depending on. And near the service station, the manager stood again, watching the flow of the room with a more careful attention than before, his expression thoughtful, as if reconsidering something he had long taken for granted. And when Maya approached to retrieve the next order, he hesitated just slightly before speaking, his tone measured. "Everything all right out there?" And the question, simple as it was, carried a weight it had not held earlier, because now it was not just routine, it was reflective, and Maya met his gaze calmly. "Yes, it is," she replied, and there was no tension in her voice, no need to explain, just a quiet assurance that spoke for itself. And the manager nodded once, slower this time, as if acknowledging more than just her answer. And across the room, a guest who had witnessed the earlier moment raised a hand gently as Maya passed, offering a quiet, "Thank you," that felt more deliberate than usual, and she responded with the same composed professionalism. But there was a subtle difference in the way the exchange lingered, as if both understood that something had shifted. And outside, Ethan's phone vibrated again, more insistent this time, the same name flashing across the screen, and this time, he answered, lifting it to his ear with a steady motion. "Ethan, where are you?" The voice on the other end asked, direct, focused, accustomed to immediate responses, and Ethan glanced briefly at the street ahead before replying, his tone calm. "I stepped away," and there was a pause, a moment of recalibration from the other side. "We need you on that call in 10 minutes. The voice continued, but Ethan did not rush to agree, did not default into the pattern that had defined so many moments before. Instead, he said, "I will be there." And though the words sounded familiar, there was something different in the way he said them, something that suggested presence rather than obligation. And as the call ended, he lowered the phone slowly, his gaze lifting again to the city around him, the buildings rising tall and indifferent, the lights flickering in windows that held stories of their own. And for a moment, he stood still again, not because he was uncertain, but because he was aware that the decision he had made inside that restaurant had not been isolated. It had drawn a line that would extend into every other space he occupied, every room he entered, every choice that followed. And inside, Maya placed another order down at a table, her movement steady, her voice even. But as she turned to walk away, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished surface of a nearby window, and for just a second, she paused, not out of vanity, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because the person she saw had not changed, not in appearance, not in role, but in something quieter, something internal that had been affirmed in a way that did not require acknowledgement from others. And she held that reflection for a moment longer before moving on, returning to the rhythm of the evening, while somewhere beyond the glass, the ripple of a single moment continued to expand, quietly shaping paths that had not yet fully revealed themselves. By the time Ethan reached his building, the city had fully settled into its late evening rhythm, the rush of traffic thinning into a steady flow of headlights and distant sounds that blended into the background. And as he stepped into the lobby, the quiet contrast between the outside world and the polished stillness of the interior space was immediate, the soft lighting reflecting off marble floors, the faint scent of polished wood and subtle cologne lingering in the air. And the receptionist looked up, offering a polite nod that carried a hint of recognition, not of what had just happened, but of who he was. And Ethan returned the nod with the same calm acknowledgement before moving toward the elevators, his reflection briefly catching in the mirrored walls as the doors slid open with a soft chime. And as he stepped inside, the space enclosed around him, isolating him from the city below, from the movement, from the noise, leaving only the quiet hum of the elevator rising floor by floor. And in that stillness, the moment from earlier returned again, not as tension this time, but as clarity, each part of it aligning into a decision that no longer required explanation. And when the doors opened, he stepped out into a hallway lined with muted tones and soft lighting, his footsteps steady, measured, until he reached his apartment, the door unlocking with a quiet click. And as he entered, the space greeted him with its familiar calm, large windows overlooking the city, the skylines stretching wide beneath the night sky, lights scattered like constellations across the dark. And he set his phone down on the counter, removing his jacket slowly, deliberately, as if shedding the last layer of the evening. And for a moment, he simply stood there, looking out at the city, his reflection faint against the glass, layered over the view beyond. And it was in that quiet pause that something unexpected surfaced. Not doubt, not regret, but a question, not about what he had done, but about what it meant moving forward. And his phone vibrated again, this time on the counter behind him, the sound soft but insistent. And when he turned to pick it up, the screen displayed multiple messages now, not just from his business partner, but from others as well, names that represented different parts of his world, different expectations. And he scrolled briefly, not reading every word, just enough to understand the urgency, the assumption that he would respond, that he would return to the rhythm he had always maintained. And yet, as he looked at those messages, there was a subtle shift in how they felt. Not burdensome, not overwhelming, but distant in a way that allowed him to see them more clearly, as parts of a larger structure that he now understood needed to align with something deeper, something more intentional. And he set the phone back down without replying immediately, turning his attention once more to the city beyond the glass, while across town, the restaurant had begun to thin out, tables clearing, the earlier tension now absorbed into the quiet routine of closing hours. And Maya moved through the space with the same steady focus, gathering plates, wiping down surfaces, her movements precise, consistent. And yet beneath that rhythm, there was a quiet awareness that had not been there before, not something that changed her actions, but something that settled within them, grounding each step, each gesture in a way that felt more certain. And near the end of her shift, as she returned to the service station, the manager approached again, his posture less rigid than earlier, his tone more considered. "You handled tonight well," he said, and the statement was simple, but it carried a recognition that had not been spoken before. And Maya met his gaze briefly, her expression calm. "I handle my job," she replied, and there was no need to elaborate, no need to expand the moment beyond what it was. And the manager nodded slowly, as if understanding that distinction, before stepping back, leaving her to finish the last of her tasks. And as she reached for her bag at the end of the counter, the soft hum of the restaurant now reduced to a quiet background noise. She paused for just a second, her hand resting lightly against the strap, her gaze drifting toward the front windows where the city lights shimmered beyond. And in that reflection, she saw not a different person, but a clearer one, someone who had stood in a moment and remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. And she picked up her bag, moving toward the exit with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through the night. While across the city, Ethan finally reached for his phone again, unlocking the screen, not to respond immediately, but to begin something else, something quieter. Something that would carry the weight of the decision he had made into the spaces that followed, because some moments did not end when the scene faded, they extended, shaping the way everything else would be seen from that point forward. The night had settled into a quiet stillness by the time Maya stepped out of the restaurant, the cool air brushing gently against her skin as the door closed softly behind her, sealing off the warmth and low hum of the dining room she had just left. And for a moment, she stood there beneath the soft glow of the exterior lights, her breath slow and steady, her hands adjusting the strap of her bag out of habit rather than necessity, as if grounding herself in something familiar after a night that had carried more weight than most. And the streets stretched out ahead, lined with passing cars and distant voices, the city alive in its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place within one of its many rooms. And Maya began to walk, her steps measured, unhurried, her mind not racing, not replaying every detail, but holding on to a few moments with a clarity that felt different from memory, because it was not about what had been said to her, but about what had not changed within her, and a car slowed briefly at the curb before continuing on, headlights sweeping across the pavement, and as she moved beneath the streetlights, her reflection appeared and disappeared in the glass windows she passed, each glimpse offering the same image, steady, composed, unchanged in ways that mattered. And across the city, Ethan stood near the wide window of his apartment, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, his phone resting in his hand. As he read through the messages that had accumulated, his expression calm but focused, as if seeing them through a different lens now, and one message in particular held his attention longer than the others, a request for a statement regarding an upcoming partnership, one that would place him in front of investors, executives, and a broader audience, and for a moment, he considered the familiar approach, the polished language, the careful framing that had defined his public presence for years. But something in him resisted that instinct, not out of rebellion, but out of alignment, and he moved toward the table, setting the phone down before opening his laptop, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his face as he began to type, not quickly, not impulsively, but with a deliberate intention that mirrored the decision he had made earlier, and the words that formed were not complex, not embellished, but clear, grounded in something that extended beyond business strategy, something that spoke to values rather than optics. And as he paused, reading what he had written, there was no hesitation, no need to soften or adjust the meaning, only a quiet understanding that this would carry forward into spaces he had not yet entered, and back on the street. Maya reached the corner where she usually waited for the bus, the metal bench cool beneath her as she sat down, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze lifting toward the passing traffic, and for a moment, she allowed herself to be still, not because she needed to process what had happened, but because she recognized that something within her had been affirmed, not changed, not altered, but seen, even if only briefly. And a man across the street glanced in her direction before looking away, the interaction fleeting, ordinary, and yet part of the larger world she navigated every day, and the bus approached in the distance, its headlights growing brighter as it neared, and Maya stood, adjusting her bag once more before stepping forward, her posture steady, her expression calm, and as she boarded, the familiar routine of tapping her card, finding a seat, and settling into the rhythm of the ride returned, grounding her in the simplicity of movement, and she looked out the window as the city passed by, lights blurring into soft streaks against the glass, her reflection faintly visible over the motion, and in that reflection, there was no trace of the tension from earlier, only a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken, and across town, Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes lifting from the screen as he reread the final line he had written, and after a brief pause, he clicked send. The action simple, almost understated, but carrying a weight that extended far beyond the room he stood in, and as he closed the laptop, the city lights beyond the window seemed to shift just slightly, not in reality, but in perception, as if the world he moved through had subtly realigned with the decision he had made, and in two different parts of the same city, two lives continued forward, not intersecting again in that moment, but connected by something that had already begun to shape what came next, quietly, steadily, and without needing to be announced. The bus moved steadily through the city, its quiet hum blending into the rhythm of the night as Maya sat by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, layered over the passing lights and blurred shapes of buildings that stretched endlessly beyond, and for a moment, everything felt suspended between movement and stillness, the kind of quiet space where thoughts did not rush but settled, forming slowly, clearly, and she rested her hand lightly against the edge of the seat, her posture relaxed but grounded, as if anchored in something deeper than the routine of the ride, and across town, Ethan stood, once more near the window of his apartment, the glow of his laptop now dimmed, the message he had sent already beginning to ripple outward into the networks and conversations that defined his world, and his phone buzzed again, not with urgency this time, but with responses, questions, acknowledgments, and he picked it up, scrolling briefly, his expression unchanged, not because the reactions did not matter, but because they no longer defined the direction he had chosen, and he set the phone aside again, allowing the silence of the room to return, while somewhere in the city, a notification appeared on a screen inside the restaurant's office. The manager glancing at it briefly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read, the words simple but clear, outlining a shift in expectations, a commitment to a standard that extended beyond service and into something more fundamental. And though he did not speak it aloud, something in his posture adjusted, a quiet acknowledgement that the environment he oversaw was no longer untouched by what had occurred earlier. And back on the bus, Maya's stop approached, the familiar intersection coming into view as the vehicle slowed, the soft hiss of the brakes marking the transition from motion to pause, and she stood, adjusting her bag with the same calm precision, stepping down onto the sidewalk as the bus pulled away behind her, leaving her in the quiet space of her neighborhood, where the lights were softer, the sounds more distant, and the rhythm of the city felt different, less hurried, more grounded. And she began to walk, her steps steady along the familiar path, passing the same buildings, the same corners, yet everything felt just slightly altered, not in appearance, but in awareness, as if the day had drawn a line that extended into the quiet of the night. And she reached her building, the door opening with a soft creak as she stepped inside, the hallway dimly lit, the scent of something warm lingering faintly in the air. And as she climbed the stairs, her hand brushing lightly against the railing, she paused for just a second midway, not out of fatigue, but out of reflection, her gaze lowering briefly as if acknowledging something she did not need to name. And then she continued, reaching her door, unlocking it with a quiet click before stepping into the small, familiar space that greeted her with stillness. And she set her bag down, her movements unhurried, her mind not replaying the evening but holding on to something quieter, something that did not demand attention, yet remained present. And across the city, Ethan finally stepped away from the window, moving through his apartment with a calm that felt different from before, not lighter, but clearer, as if the weight he carried had shifted into something more aligned. And he reached for a glass of water, the simple act grounding him in the present moment, the coolness of it steadying. And as he set the glass down, his gaze drifted once more toward the city beyond, not searching, not questioning, but observing, aware that what had begun earlier was not finished, that the impact of a single decision would continue to unfold in ways that extended beyond immediate understanding. And in two different spaces, separated by distance, but connected by a shared moment, the night settled into a quiet continuation, not marked by dramatic change, but by a subtle, undeniable shift in direction, one that would carry forward into the morning, into the next set of choices, into the spaces where values were no longer abstract, but lived, expressed, and seen in ways that could not be undone once revealed. Morning arrived quietly, not with urgency, not with noise, but with a soft shift in light that filtered through the city, touching windows, streets, and the lives that moved within them. And in a small apartment across town, Maya stood near her window, a cup of coffee resting lightly in her hands, the warmth rising gently against her palms as she looked out at the neighborhood below, where people were already beginning their day, walking dogs, unlocking storefronts, stepping into routines that felt both ordinary and essential. And she took a slow sip, her gaze steady, not searching for anything new, but acknowledging something that had settled within her overnight, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And she set the cup down on the counter, moving with the same quiet precision that had carried her through the evening before, preparing for another day that would likely look the same from the outside, but feel just slightly different beneath the surface. And across the city, Ethan sat at his desk, the morning light casting a soft glow across the room as his laptop screen displayed the responses that had come in overnight, emails, messages, articles beginning to form around the statement he had sent. And he read them not with urgency, not with concern, but with a calm awareness, as if observing the natural consequence of a decision rather than reacting to it. And one message in particular caught his attention, not from an investor, not from a partner, but from someone within his own company, a brief note acknowledging the clarity of his stance, the importance of what had been said. And he paused there, just for a moment, before closing the message, not dismissing it, but allowing it to settle, without needing to respond immediately. And he stood, Walking toward the window once more, the city stretching out beneath him in the early light, different from the night before, quieter, more open, and for a second, he caught his reflection again, layered over the skyline, and there was no question in it now, no duality, only a single, steady presence that felt aligned in a way it had not before, and back in her apartment, Maya gathered her things, her movements unhurried as she prepared to leave, the routine familiar, grounding, and as she reached for the door, her hand resting briefly on the handle, she paused for just a second, her mind not replaying the events of the night, but holding on to the quiet truth that had emerged from it, not about the people involved, not about the words spoken, but about herself, about the way she had stood, remained, continued without losing anything essential, and she opened the door, stepping out into the hallway, the soft echo of her footsteps marking the beginning of another day, and somewhere between those two spaces, between the quiet of her apartment and the movement of the city beyond, something connected, not visibly, not directly, but in the way two paths could be shaped by the same moment. Without needing to cross again, and as she walked toward the bus stop, the morning air cool and steady, a neighbor passed by with a small nod, and she returned it with the same calm acknowledgement, her presence unchanged, her posture grounded, and across town, Ethan reached for his phone once more, this time not to read, not to observe, but to act, his fingers moving with quiet certainty as he began to outline the next steps, not just for business, but for the culture he influenced, the spaces he shaped, and as he set the phone down, there was no hesitation in what followed, only a clear understanding that what had begun as a moment in a restaurant had become something more, something that would continue to define the choices ahead, and as the city moved forward into the day, the memory of that evening did not fade, it settled, embedding itself into the quiet fabric of what came next, not as a story to be told, but as a standard to be lived, and in two different places, two people stepped into their day with the same quiet truth, that dignity did not need to be announced to exist, and respect, once chosen, did not need permission to remain.